planet on which they live was, of course, first sighted from space by the astronauts of NASA. This famous image taken by Bill Anders, Earthrise, which in some senses kick-started the idea of the environmental movement, but also reminded us of just how fragile our planet was. We also, of course, had yesterday the latest of the launches into space. And I would consider that perhaps billionaires may also consider spending some of their money to solve some of our climate issues here on the planet Earth, rather than seeking to go into space. This is me in 1975, when I started my own secondary education. In the UK, that's equivalent to K7 to 12. Now, back then, of course, geography, I would say, was a rather different subject, and the Earth was a rather different place. 1975 is almost 50 years, half a century. How much has our subject moved on in that time? What new geographies have emerged? Part of my work this year has been to develop a theme for my presidential year. And the theme is everyday geographies. My everyday geographies, my everyday encounters with other people, with the subject discipline, are different to they were back then. So what do we need to do to develop this idea of everyday geographies? Well, at the heart of geography, of course, is our home. All of our everyday geographies play out on this pale blue dot in space. And as a teacher, one of my daily jobs every day is to explore what happens on this sphere, the processes, the connections, the people. And all of you, of course, are working within your own spheres of geography. Many of you will perhaps have academic specialisms which focus on a very specific part of this sphere. Others will think more broadly. Now, as a teacher, of course, my job is to try to see the big picture and introduce students to the whole of the planet, but also to consider quotidian experiences, those daily experiences that students have, and to translate those into geography so that what they're seeing as they live their lives is connected with the discipline. And they're also introduced to the vocabulary of geography. And that vocabulary may then be turned into a grammar, a language of geography, which hopefully they become proficient in by the time they reach undergraduate level and perhaps encounter many of you who are here today. As part of that work, I've been involved in a whole range of Erasmus and other projects. Geo-capabilities, some of you may be familiar with, looking at a capabilities approach to geographical education. I'm fortunate to work with David Lambert, Sir Patani and Michael Solem, who have perhaps spoken here before. The D3 project looks at data literacy, open data, huge amount of open data generated as young people live their lives. How can that be used geographically? The GI Pedagogy project explores the pedagogy of GIS. So not just looking at the resources and approaches to thinking about the planet, but also using Rosenshine's principles to explore how to teach with and about GIS in a slightly different way. And also the top right, young people's geographies, projects which give young people agency in the curriculum, so that actually they're part of that curriculum process. Now, my thinking's been informed by a whole lot of reading, because of course, as geographers, we really do have to read widely. The more we read, the more we experience other worlds, other aspects of our subject. So these three extracts here from three books that influenced my thinking. We have Julian Bagini's book, where he spent 6 months in the average place in the UK. An extract from a book by Georges Perec, which looks at exhausting a place where he sat in a place for 2 days and recorded everything he saw. And a similar approach from Kevin Boniface here, a sort of psychogeographical approach, looking at the surroundings and unpicking the intersections that happen in that space. And Perec is a really interesting and fascinating character. He talks here about thinking about just how many square centimeters of planet Earth will we have touched in our lifetimes, very little in fact. So we're writing a geography. Every one of us is writing everyday geographies. Now, this is the date of my birth, 1963. Very different planet. A planet with fewer than half the population that it has now, where carbon dioxide levels were 319 parts per million compared to today's 413. The world has changed since that time. Jobs have changed. My father was a steel worker in Sheffield in South Yorkshire. And on the right, we have a token used by my grandfather, who was a coal miner, to make sure that he'd left the shaft and not been left underground. He would hand his token in when he went down in the lift. So what we have here are changing geographies of employment then. Changing geographies of childhood. Childhood is a branch of cartography. How many of us refer back to childhood memories when we're teaching undergraduates, even today, thinking back to how our own geographical imaginations started to be formed? Now, of course, in the last 18 months, our geographies have been diminished. Our horizons have shrunk to the immediate vicinity of our home. Connections have been severed. And events like this are a chance to reconnect, to discuss once again with peers and colleagues the experiences and consider how they might inform our teaching and how we might also support young people through the next phase of their lives, having had a disrupted 2 years of education. So the last time they had a proper year of education was 2 years ago. And talking through some of the ideas there about how we support young learners back into exploring their own personal geographies. And this is where I teach. It's a city called Ely. It has a wonderful cathedral, 10 miles east of Cambridge. This is the sort of world in which the students that I teach inhabit. It's very different to my own upbringing in Yorkshire, an industrial city. So it's also about thinking about the lifetime of travelling and development that we undertake when we're teaching. Now, I mentioned carbon dioxide earlier, and of course, we're currently living through a period which many are calling the Anthropocene, where we're seeing unprecedented changes in temperature. The young people we teach are going to live within that phase, within that historical period. And I refer to them to the maps of Ben Hennig, who has reshaped our thinking with his gridded cartograms of the Anthropocene, a map here tracing the movements of container shipping and the world distorted according to population. This is a world we're going to see change utterly as well. Parag Khanna's new book, Move, explores the importance of movement and how, as a species, we've always moved, but the reasons for our future movements may well be very different. Now, all of this forms part of the curriculum that I teach to students aged 11 to 13, to get them thinking about their own place in this world. And I also draw on the work of the Geographical Association. The Geographical Association publishes journals. This is an article by Alaric Maud from our journal Geography, which explores powerful geographical knowledge. Again, something which has emerged in the last decade or so within teaching. Lambert and Morgan talk about our discipline as being in a constant state of becoming. So every day, geography subtly shifts, the world subtly shifts. And that needs to be reflected in the curriculum that we teach. But along with powerful knowledge, we also need powerful pedagogies. So the teacher educator, Margaret Roberts, here in our journal, Teaching Geography, talks about the importance of pedagogy. Without the teacher, without the teacher's knowledge of discipline, then we have simply a lot of facts which need shaping in young people's lives. It needs to be introduced to them in a structured way. And this again is part of the work of educators at all levels, of course, not just in schools, but at all levels. In our secondary geography handbook, published by the Geographical Association, an article by John Hopkin presents this model, if you like, of aspects of learning in geography. And you can see here, top left, the fact that we challenge and deepen knowledge in the classroom. Okay. Also that we perhaps use inquiry as a framework for that, and that we are critical about the knowledge that we present to young people, but also vitally they themselves are critical of what they are presented with, and they need tools to be able to do that. And finally, of course, there's a values angle to this too. Our own and others' values. And it's quite difficult actually to keep those values neutral when you're in the classroom. But it's something that we need to do, even though geography is inherently political and inherently connected with many of the structures that young people are embedded within in their lives. Now, a lot of this is in a book which I've published just under a year ago. It's called Why Study Geography? It's an important question. It's a question that your students may well ask. It's a question that your students may well have decided is worth studying, of course. And the book explores aspects of the discipline, but also the importance of geographers. We need more geographers in the future. The world is definitely going to need more people with the types of thinking that geography creates. Now, as part of that work, what I did is start to explore this notion of everyday geographies and connect with people who weren't necessarily geographers or called themselves geographers, but that their work was geographic. So here we have the work of Paula Succotti. Paula Succotti has created this project called Everything We Touch, where she photographs every item touched by individuals during a 24-hour period. And we can then start to unpick why these objects exist, how they move around the planet, who creates them, what impact does their creation have on the planet, what items do we touch, what does that tell us that other people about us, how is our personality, how is our daily life influenced by the things that we have access to? Because of course the things that I touch in my everyday existence will be different to those people living in other parts of the world, even within other parts of the country, and even within other parts of the city in which I'm sitting now. We all have our personal geographies. There's also the belongings, and the personal belongings taken by refugees fleeing conflict. What would you choose to take with you? What would be irreplaceable? What could you not leave behind if you were suddenly forced to leave your home, as many people are? We also explore with young people the importance of that invisible infrastructure, the shipping containers, which bring those items to us from distant locations. And when that system begins to creak, when that system begins to be affected by, for example, the recent disruptions, and of course in the UK, we have the additional complication of Brexit, and we have problems perhaps with providing those items just in time when we need them. And so at the moment we have some supply chain issues globally as a result of some of the events of the last 2 years, but we explore that notion of supply chains. That brings us to what is essential. Companies like Amazon have grown tremendously during the lockdowns as people had items delivered to their homes. Retail and other sectors of the economy began to suffer. But do we really need to buy all the things that we buy? Can we get by without it? What actually is really important in life? And these were notions explored by the late Professor Hans Rosling, who presented at our Geographical Association conference in 2013, where he talked about his gapminder work, the Dollar Street work of Anna Rosling-Runland, and the stress-reducing habit of only holding opinions for which you have strong supporting facts. And that means that we need facts, we need data. And during the lockdown, of course, this GIS map became possibly one of the most visited and viewed maps in the world. A map showing data, GIS in action, developed by Johns Hopkins University in the United States, but showing that global spread and those global connections between places that are unavoidable. David Farrier, in his 2020 book, Footprints, talks about this idea of our possessions ultimately becoming the fossils of the future. Future archaeologists unearthing a whole layer in the Earth's geology of discarded Alexas, discarded smartwatches, discarded laptops, and every house being a clock, marking the passage of our time on Earth. This quote here: as we are at home, we begin to be confronted by the reality of our daily lives. Home for some has been a refuge, for others a torment. We have all been confronted by where we spend our days, which of course is at the heart of the concept of place, this important geographical concept, which underpins a lot of my work in schools. Young people recognizing their place in the world, how as they live their lives, those places change. This is a central concept. And once we begin to travel again, we'll be able to see how our place compares with others. Again, a vital part of geography, from the familiar to the unfamiliar, from the local to the global. So a few years ago, I was fortunate to visit the Mer de Glace in the Swiss Alps with geographer Richard Alloway. And as you go down to the ice surface, you're confronted with signs which remind you of where the level of the ice was in particular years. And here's a photo I took on the way down to the ice, 1990, so 30 years on, hundreds of meters of ice lost. Those everyday changes to the planet. Finally, I'd like to reference Doreen Massey here, who again spoke at our Geographical Association conference. And she reminded us of the simultaneity of our lives, the fact that as you open a map, on those maps, there are lots of intersections of people, simultaneous stories. So maps as a narrative. We use maps all the time in geography, of course, but how much have our personal maps changed over the last 2 years? In the last few weeks, of course, the world has started to come back to life again. Skies over Turkey here filling with aircraft again, as shown on Flight Radar 24. Each one of those aircraft full of people. Where are they going to? Where have they come from? What are their purposes for traveling? How are they impacting the planet with their daily existence? All things that we should study in geography. And this app, of course, helping us to reveal those hidden stories, which we can only see as contrails in the sky above us, perhaps. Now, you're very welcome to attend the Geographic Association's conference. We're having a hybrid conference this year, face-to-face at the University of Surrey in Guildford in the UK, and online too. We'll be revealing our speakers soon, an exciting array of speakers, talking about the everyday. This quote here, I think, is really important. Little minds are interested in the extraordinary, great minds in the commonplace. Every day, those little commonplace, quotidian encounters create our own personal geographies. Please feel free to visit my blog, Living Geography. Over 10,000 blog posts on there telling the story of geographical change over the last 13 years. And if you're interested in finding out more about the presidents, and I've created a blog also with a biography of all 106, and some of the names there you may well recognize. That's all part of the work I'm doing this year to develop the idea of everyday geographies. My presentation is referenced with all the links to the reading if you'd like to know more. Thank you very much for listening. Again, it's been a delight to speak to you. Very best wishes for the rest of your Congress and for the rest of this academic year. And I wish you good health and hope to perhaps see some of you in the future.